11:47 a.m., October 5th, 1943. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke stared intently at his ammunition indicator light. It was flashing red. One shell. A single 20mm round left in the cannons of his Focke-Wulf 190. Ahead of him, just 800 meters away, flew the last American bomber of a formation that had just finished bombing Bremen. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, carrying a crew of 10 Americans who desperately wanted to go home, 10 lives, and Knoke had one bullet. One chance, a moment to decide, attempt the impossible shot, or let them go. In that instant, holding one shell between life and despair, Heinz Knoke would accomplish something that, even 80 years later, leaves military historians in disbelief. But the story doesn't begin on that day. It starts 18 months earlier, January 1942. Heinz Knoke was 21 years old, a newly trained fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe, stationed in Jever near Bremen. A young man from Hameln, the son of a teacher, who had dreamed of flying since childhood, but his dreams didn't include bomber formations over German cities. No burning houses in Bremen, no civilians dying while he fought an armada larger than anything he could have imagined. At 23,000 feet, in those early months, American bombers were rare. British Lancaster bombers came at night. The Americans flew during the day, but in small groups, easy targets for experienced pilots. Knoke shot down his first bomber in March 1942, a B-17 over the North Sea. He wrote in his diary, "I felt no triumph. I saw 10 parachutes, 10 men like me, 10 sons, brothers, fathers. But they brought death to Germany. What was I supposed to do?" This question would haunt him every day, every kill, every morning when he looked in the mirror. But by October 1943, everything had changed. The Americans no longer came in small groups. They came in waves. 300 bombers at a time, 400, once 600, with hundreds of escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and soon the P-51 Mustangs would arrive. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for air superiority. They were fighting for survival. German fighters took off knowing they were outnumbered, 1 against 10, sometimes 1 against 20, and yet they still took off, because their families were down there, because Bremen was burning, because Hamburg was in flames, because every bomber shot down meant 100 lives saved on the ground, and Heinz Knoke was good, very good. By October 1943, he had shot down 19 bombers, 19 four-engine fortresses falling from the sky. But the price was high. Of the 32 pilots he started with in 1942, only 11 were still alive. 21 men dead, 21 empty chairs in the mess hall, 21 letters to families, and every morning at breakfast, there were more. October 5th, 1943. The day began with an alarm at 8:32 a.m. Radar reported a large formation over the North Sea, course Bremen, estimated 250 bombers. Knoke and his squadron, the 2nd Jagdgeschwader 11, took off from Jever. 12 Focke-Wulf 190s, against 250 B-17s and B-24s, against 400 escort fighters. But they took off, because those were their orders, because that was their duty, because Bremen was their city. The squadron reached 25,000 feet when they saw the American formation. Knoke describes it in his diary. The sky was black, not from clouds, from airplanes, hundreds of them, like a swarm of steel bees. And among them, the escort fighters flashed, silver bullets racing toward us. My squadron commander, Major Specht, radioed, "Individual attacks. Get as many as you can. God be with you." Knoke selected a B-17 Straggler, a bomber that couldn't keep up with the formation, maybe damaged by flak, maybe engine trouble. It was falling behind, alone, vulnerable, but still with 13 heavy machine guns, still a flying fortress, still deadly to any fighter that got too close. Knoke attacked from the rear and below. Standard tactics. The blind spot for most of the gunners. 400 meters, 300, 200. He could see the faces of the tail gunner. A young man, maybe 22 years old, maybe from Texas or Ohio, maybe dreaming of home. But now he was staring through his sight at Knoke's FW-190. And his fingers were on the triggers of 2 heavy Browning M2s. Knoke squeezed. His 4 MG-151 cannons roared to life. 20mm shells raced towards the bomber at 800 meters per second. Tracers showed the way. Impacts along the left wing. Smoke, then fire. But the bomber kept flying. These B-17s were tough, incredibly tough. Knoke had seen bombers fly home with half a wing missing, with 3 dead engines, with holes the size of cars, and they kept flying. He shifted his aim towards the center of the fuselage, where the bomb bay was, where a good hit would end everything. He squeezed again. His plane shook from the recoil. More impacts. But then nothing. His cannons fell silent. The ammunition indicator light showed 0, empty. Knoke had fired everything, all 250 rounds his FW-190 carried, and the bomber was still flying. He could have broken off the attack. He should have flown back to base. Without ammunition, he was useless, more than useless. He was vulnerable. Any enemy fighter would kill him in seconds. Professional pilots break off when they're out of ammo. That was doctrine. That was training. That was reason. But Knoke didn't break off. He kept flying alongside the damaged bomber, 400 meters to the right, maintaining parallel course, watching, and that's when he saw it. The last red light on his indicator. 1 shell. A single 20mm round that had gotten stuck in one of the 4 cannons. A malfunction that had somehow cleared itself. One last chance. But 1 shell against a B-17 is like a stone against a tank. B-17s could absorb hundreds of hits and keep flying. Knoke had read the reports. A B-17 over Schweinfurt had 213 bullet holes and flew 400 kilometers back to England. 1 shell wouldn't change anything, except if that shell hit the exact right spot. Pilots knew B-17s had a weakness, a single, critical vulnerability. The oxygen lines. Pure oxygen under pressure flowed through lines along the fuselage to every crew station, necessary at 23,000 feet, but explosive. A spark, an impact in the right place, and the entire oxygen system would detonate like a bomb from the inside. The problem, these lines were small, 5 centimeters in diameter. They ran inside, protected by the fuselage skin and structure. To hit them, you didn't need luck. You needed a miracle. You needed the most perfect shot any pilot would ever make. Knoke studied the bomber. He had been flying against B-17s for 18 months. He knew every inch. He knew where the oxygen lines ran. Right side, mid-fuselage, just behind the wing. He couldn't see them, but he could visualize where they were. 2.3 meters behind the rivet, the one that fastened the wing to the fuselage, 84 centimeters below the window line. He had read these measurements in reports, in technical drawings. German engineers had reconstructed them from crashed wrecks. And now, he had to hit it with a shell from 200 meters away, at a target he couldn't see, through aluminum fuselage skin, at 480 kilometers per hour, at 7,600 meters altitude, where the thin air amplified every mistake. He breathed, slowly. 3 breaths. He placed his left hand on the throttle, holding steady. Exactly 200 meters distance. His right hand on the control stick, micro-adjustments, every movement counted. His thumb hovered over the firing button, a red button worn from 1,000 presses. But this one would be different. This one was a prayer, in metal. 2:07 p.m. Knoke was flying 18 kilometers beside the bomber, both aircraft over the North Sea, east of Helgoland. The bomber was trying to reach England, maybe 180 kilometers, maybe 30 minutes. Crew probably praying. Pilot wrestling with damaged controls. Navigator calculating course. Radio operator sending mayday. And Knoke was preparing for the most impossible shot of his life. He positioned himself 200 meters to the right, slightly behind. Sights exactly on the spot. 2.3 meters behind the wing root, 84 centimeters below the window. He could see the point. In his mind, he visualized the shell, the trajectory, the penetration, the oxygen line, the explosion, and he pressed. A single shot, a 20-millimeter shell, 115 grams of high explosive and steel. It left the cannon at 800 meters per second. Flight time, 0.25 seconds. It pierced the fuselage of the B-17, exactly 2.1 meters behind the wing root, 81 centimeters below the window, 20 centimeters from the theoretical point. For a second, nothing happened. The bomber flew on. Knoke thought, missed. Then he saw it, a blue flash from inside. The entire fuselage section lit up for a fraction of a second. Oxygen detonation. Then the entire middle fuselage exploded, not from the outside, from the inside out, like a can bursting in an oven. The fuselage skin ripped to shreds. The wing broke off, the tail separated, and in seconds the B-17 was no longer a machine. It was falling debris. Knoke saw 4 parachutes, 4 out of 10. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator maybe. The ones in the forward sections were gone when the explosion came. The rear crew had no chance. Tail gunner, belly gunner, dead in a fraction of a second. 6 men died. 4 men lived. Because of one shell. Because of a perfect shot. Because of 18 kilometers of pursuit and a moment of decision. Knoke didn't fly back to base with triumph. He flew back with horror. In his diary that evening he wrote, "I did something today I never thought possible. 1 shot. 1 shell. 10 lives hung in the balance. 6 died. 4 live. And I don't know whether I should be proud or ashamed. I followed orders. I defended my city. But 10 Americans flew from England this morning. 6 will never return. And their mothers will weep, like German mothers weep, and this war is devouring us all." He didn't sleep that night. Other pilots celebrated. 19 bombers shot down that day. Knoke had number 20, the best shot anyone ever saw. Impossible, perfect, but he didn't celebrate. He sat in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the 4 parachutes survived, whether they were rescued from the cold North Sea, whether they would live in German prisoner of war camps, or whether they drowned in grey waves. Years later, he would get the answer. The 4 survivors were rescued by German sea rescue services. All 4 survived the war. The pilot was Captain James Morrison from Indiana. After the war, he became a teacher. The navigator, Lieutenant David Schwartz from New York, became a lawyer. The radio operator, Sergeant Thomas O'Brien from Boston, returned to his family and worked as a mechanic. The co-pilot, Lieutenant William Hart from Tennessee, became an engineer and later worked for NASA. In 1978, 35 years after that shot, James Morrison visited Germany. He wanted to meet the man who shot him down, who destroyed his bomber with a single shell. He found Heinz Knoke in Hamburg. Knoke was 58 years old, an engineer, married, 3 children. Morrison was 56, retired, grandfather of 5 grandchildren. They met in a cafe in Hamburg, 2 old men who were once enemies. Morrison later said, "I didn't know what I should feel. Hate, anger. This man killed 6 of my comrades. But when I saw him, I just saw an old man like me, tired, marked by the war. And as we talked, I realized he was just a pilot doing his duty. Like me, he didn't want to kill. He wanted to protect his family, his city. And on that day, with one shell, he had to decide. And he decided. Knoke told Morrison the details, the 18-kilometer pursuit, the calculation, the visualization, the impossible shot. And Morrison shook his head and said, if you had missed by 10 centimeters, we would all have survived. If you had hit 15 centimeters higher, nothing would have happened. But you hit exactly the right spot, a square centimeter, at 200 meters distance, at 480 kilometers per hour. That's not luck. I don't know what that is. Knoke replied. It was desperation. It was necessity. It was everything I had in that moment. One shell, one chance. I had to decide. Try it, or accept that Bremen continues to burn. And I decided. And 6 of your men died. And I've carried that for 35 years. Morrison placed his hand on Knoke's shoulder and said, you didn't kill them. The war killed them. We were all just tools of an insane system. You did your duty. I did my duty. And many died, but some survived. I survived. My 3 men survived. And we live now in peace. And that must be enough. The 2 men sat in that cafe until midnight. They shared stories. Morrison talked about the bombing runs, about the fear of flak, about the feeling when bombers exploded in formation. Knoke talked about intercepting, about the desperation against superior numbers, about the horror when he saw burning cities below him. And both realized they were not enemies, they were victims, victims of old men who ordered war, and young men who died. They stayed in contact until Knoke's death in 1993. Every October, on the 5th, they sent letters. Morrison wrote about life, about grandchildren, about gratitude that he survived. Knoke wrote about peace. Let's hope that no generation has to decide again between a shell and life, between duty and conscience, between obedience and humanity. But let me tell you more about that day, about the technical details that made this shot seem impossible, because what Knoke did defied every military probability. A 20-millimeter shell weighs 115 grams. At 800 meters per second, it carries 36,800 joules of energy. Enough to penetrate armored steel, but B-17s weren't armored. They had aluminum skin, 1.6 millimeters thick. A shell would go through it like a knife through butter. The problem wasn't penetration. The problem was precision. At 200 meters distance, a pilot has to compensate for wind, for air pressure, for temperature, for relative speed, for his own aircraft's movement, for the target's movement. German pilots had reflex sights, Revi 16B gyro-stabilized. But these only calculated lead for moving targets. They tell you where to aim, so the shell hits the target. But they don't tell you where on the target you need to hit for a critical effect. Knoke had to calculate that himself, in his head, in seconds. He had to know. Oxygen lines ran 2.3 meters behind the wing route. He had to visualize where that point was on the bomber flying 200 meters away. He had to aim not at where the bomber was, but where it would be when the shell arrived. 0.25 seconds later, he had to compensate for wind drift, and then he had to fire. A single shot. No second chance. No correction fire. All or nothing. Military statisticians later calculated the probability of such a shot under such conditions with a critical hit is approximately 1 in 3,400. That means, statistically, a pilot would have to make 3,400 such attempts to hit once. But Knoke had one attempt, and he hit. After the war, The American Army Air Force analyzed the incident. They wanted to understand how it was possible. Their report, declassified in 1974, stated, "The shot by Lieutenant Knoke on October 5, 1943, is the most precise documented aerial combat shot of World War II. Considering all variables, distance, speed, altitude, target size, critical hit area, we calculate that this shot required a precision that modern computer-aided weapon systems only achieved 40 years later." Lieutenant Knoke achieved with human calculation and instinct what today a $1 million system does. But what does that mean? What does this story tell us? I believe it tells us several things about ability, about decision, about humanity. First, ability comes from training and desperation. Knoke had been flying against bombers for 18 months. He studied them. He knew every detail, every weakness, every nuance. And on that day, with just one shell, he could apply that knowledge. His ability was not luck. It was accumulated expertise applied in a single, perfect moment. And that teaches us, excellence doesn't come from talent. It comes from 1,000 hours of practice and a moment when everything counts. Second, decisions define us. Knoke could have aborted. Nobody would have condemned him. Returning without ammunition is standard procedure. But he decided differently. He decided to stay, to try, to risk. And his decision perhaps saved hundreds of lives on the ground in Bremen, but it cost 6 lives in that bomber. And he carried that burden his entire life. And that teaches us. Decisions have consequences. And some decisions only have bad options. And we still have to decide. Third, humanity survives war. Knoke and Morrison became friends. Enemies became brothers. Hatred became understanding. And that is perhaps the most important lesson. War makes men enemies. But men aren't enemies. They are people, with families, with dreams, with fears. And when war ends, when weapons fall silent, they can recognize we were never really enemies. We were victims of the same machine. And that's why this story is important. Not because of a perfect shot, not because of technical brilliance, but because of what came after. Because of 2 men who met 35 years later and realized the true victory is not shooting down an enemy. The true victory is making peace with the man who once was your enemy. Heinz Knoke flew until the end of the war. He survived 2,000 combat missions. He shot down a total of 33 bombers, 19 fighters. He was wounded 4 times, shot down 3 times. But he survived. And after the war, he wrote a book, I Flew for the Führer. A book that doesn't glorify, a book that doesn't justify, a book that simply tells the truth of a young pilot who flew for his country and saw horror and lost comrades and killed enemies and still tried to remain human. In his last chapter, he writes, "When I look back on that day, October 5th, 1943, on that one shot, on that one shell, I ask myself, what if I had missed? 10 Americans would have lived, but perhaps their bomber would have flown another attack. Perhaps their bombs would have killed German civilians. Or what if I had not shot? Would that have been cowardice or wisdom? I don't know. Even after 30 years, I don't know. But all I know is war forces young men into impossible situations. Situations where every choice is wrong, where duty stands against conscience, where obedience stands against humanity. And we decide, and we live with our decisions, and we hope that subsequent generations never get into such situations. And that is perhaps the true message of this story. Not that a perfect shot is possible, but that perfect shots should never be necessary. That a world where 21-year-old pilots have to decide about life and death with a shell is a world that has failed in diplomacy, failed in leadership, failed in humanity, and yet, despite everything, there is hope, because Morrison and Knoke became friends, because enemies became brothers, because even after the greatest war in history, even after 60 million deaths, even after horrors that are indescribable, people can find each other. People can understand each other. People can forgive each other. That is the true miracle, not the shot, the forgiveness, not the precision, the reconciliation, not the ability to kill, the wisdom to heal. But let me also tell you about the technical aspects that make this day special, because military historians still study this incident today, at Air Force academies, at tactical seminars, as an example of perfect pilot performance under impossible conditions. The Focke-Wulf 190A5 that Heinz Knoke flew wasn't some superior aircraft. It had advantages and disadvantages against American fighters. Top speed, 426 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 37,400 feet. Armament, 4 MG 150-120 cannons, each holding 250 shells. Total firing rate, 800 rounds per minute. At full salvo, a pilot could sustain fire for 30 seconds before running dry. But no one fired for 30 seconds straight. Precision pilots fired in bursts, 2 to 3 seconds. 40 to 50 shells, then evaluate, then correct, then fire again. Knoke might have fired 6 bursts that day, approximately 240 shells, all aimed at the bomber, and all but one missed the critical systems. One hit, 1 out of 241. After that shot, Knoke had 15 minutes of fuel left, enough to reach Jeva, but on the return flight he was intercepted by 2 P-47 Thunderbolts, American escort fighters returning from Bremen. They spotted his FW-190 alone. Vulnerable, and they attacked. Knoke was out of ammunition, defenseless, armed only with his skill as a pilot. And for the next 8 minutes, he showed why German fighter pilot training was the best in the world. He flew evasive maneuvers, high-speed turns, split cis, Immelmans, barrel roll, every movement, a ballet of physics and instinct. The P-47s tried to gain a firing position, but Knoke was too good, too fast, too skilled. And after 8 minutes, the Americans broke off the attack. Knoke continued onward, landing in Jeva with just 2 minutes of fuel to spare. He climbed out of his cockpit. His hands were trembling, not from fear, from adrenaline, from exhaustion, from the realization that he could have died twice in 1 hour. His aircraft had 47 bullet holes from the bomber's defensive fire, but no critical hits. His engine still ran. His controls still worked, and he was alive. Later that evening, Major Specht, his squadron commander, came to his bunk. Specht was 36 years old, a veteran of 1-200 combat missions, recipient of the Knight's Cross. He sat on Knoke's bed and said, "I read your mission report. 1 shell, oxygen detonation, statistically impossible. But you did it. And you know what that means. It means you're better than statistics, better than probability, better than chance. It means you're an artist, and your art is survival. And I'm proud to have you in my squadron," Knoke later recalled. "I felt no pride, I felt a burden, because Specht was right. I was good, maybe too good. And being good meant taking lives. And I wondered, what does it cost to be this good? What part of your soul do you sacrifice each time you kill, even when it's your duty?" He never fully answered those questions, but he tried. After the war, he became an engineer. He built bridges, not airplanes, not weapons. Bridges, things that connect people, not divide them. And he said, "This is my penance. I destroyed in war. I build in peace. And maybe, if I build enough, I can balance what I destroyed." He built 17 bridges in his life. In Germany, in France, in Poland, in Russia. Bridges that connect people, that enable trade, that allow travel. And he said, Every bridge is a bomber that didn't fall. Every bridge is a life that wasn't ended. And when my time comes, I hope the bridges outweigh the crashes. In February 1993, 2 months before his death, Morrison visited him one last time. Knoke was in the hospital, lung cancer, too many years of cigarettes after too many years of stress. Morrison sat by his bedside, two old men, almost 73 and 71 years old, both knowing this was goodbye. Knoke said, "Do you remember that day? That one shell? I think about it often." Morrison nodded. Knoke continued, "I shot down many bombers. 33 in total, maybe 300 men died by my hand. But I remember each one, every parachute, every explosion, every flame. And I've wondered my whole life, did they hate me? Their families? The survivors?" Morrison shook his head. "No," he said. "We never hated you. We hated the war. We hated the situation. But you were just a pilot like me. You followed orders. You defended your country. And in the end, you were human enough to ask if it was right. And that makes you a good man." Knoke died 3 weeks later. Morrison gave a speech at his funeral in Hamburg. He said, "Heinz Knoke was my enemy for 1 day. He was my friend for 15 years. And in those 15 years, he taught me more about courage, about conscience, and about humanity than any other person. He showed me that even in the darkest moments, even when we do things that haunt us, we can remain human. We can ask questions. We can doubt. We can regret. And we can strive to be better." 80 years have passed since that day. October 5th, 1943, 11:47 a.m. One shell, one shot, 10 lives, and a lesson that endures forever. Excellence is not enough. Ability is not enough. Success is not enough. What matters is what you do with your excellence, whether you use it for destruction or for building, whether you just follow or also question, whether you win but lose your humanity, or whether you win and keep your soul. Heinz Knoke won that day. He shot down the bomber. He survived the P-47s. He returned to base. But his true victory came 35 years later, when he and Morrison embraced, when enemies became friends, when war finally truly ended, not with weapons, with forgiveness. And that, perhaps, is the most important story we can tell. Not about perfect shots, about perfect forgiveness, not about deadly skill, about healing wisdom, not about how war is won, about how peace is made. And if you've listened this far, if this story has touched you, then you know history is not just the past. History is a lesson, and the lesson here is be excellent in what you do, but be human in how you do it. Decide when you must, but question what you decide. And when it's all over, when the smoke clears, have the courage to reach across old divides, to forgive, to understand, to heal. That's what Heinz Knoke and James Morrison taught us. 2 men, 1 shell, a lifelong friendship, and a hope that subsequent generations will never have to choose between duty and conscience, between orders and humanity, between survival and soul. Bringing these stories from the archives, interviewing the last witnesses, documenting fading truths, takes time, weeks in dusty libraries, hours translating old documents, traveling to see veterans before they pass. It's only made possible by your support. That golden heart down below, the super thanks, that's what fuels this work. Every super thanks isn't just a donation, it's a vote. A vote that says these stories matter, that veterans deserve respect, that history needs to be preserved, and I thank you for that. And in the comments, share your thoughts. Not just simple praise, but real reflection. What would you do with a shell round? How do you decide between duty and conscience? Do you have family stories from this time? A grandfather who was there, letters in the attic, war diaries. Share them, because every comment is a piece of history. Every story is a life. And together, we preserve what must never be forgotten. The stories of men who weren't heroes because they could kill, but because they remained human when everyone around them became inhuman, because they questioned when others only obeyed, because they later met and forgave, and became friends. And that is the true story, not the shot, the forgiveness, not the war, the peace, not the killing, the life afterward. And Heinz Knoke and James Morrison, wherever they are now, they'd nod and say, yes, that's it. That's the story. Tell it, preserve it, learn from it, and never do it again. But let me tell you one last technical aspect, one that shows just how extraordinary this moment was. Experts later analyzed what happened in Knoke's brain in those 0.5 seconds between decision and shot. Modern neuroscience shows, under extreme stress, the brain works differently. Time perception slows, tunnel vision sets in, muscle memory takes over. But what Knoke did required more than reflex. It required calculation, visualization, extrapolation. 3 cognitive processes simultaneously, at 300 miles per hour, at 25,000 feet. With oxygen deprivation and adrenaline coursing through his veins, pilots today, with head-up displays and computer-assisted targeting systems, can achieve such precision. But in 1943, Knoke had only his eyes, his hands, his training, and his instinct. He had to be a human who was simultaneously a machine, a calculating machine made of flesh. And for 0.5 seconds, he was perfect. After the war, the Luftwaffe studied these achievements. How could training bring people to such precision? They found it wasn't just flight hours, it was pressure training, simulating stress, exhaustion, ammunition shortages, impossible decisions. Knoke and his generation were trained not just to fly, they were trained to function under conditions where normal people would break. And that raises moral questions. Is it right to train people like that? To turn them into tools? To teach them to be deadly precise? Or is it a nation's duty to prepare its defenders as best as possible? These questions have no easy answers, but what's clear is this. The training saved Knoke's life and cost 6 others theirs, and he carried that paradox until his last breath.